Okay, let's talk about our first macroeconomic concept I want to talk about is employment, unemployment, civilian labor force, and how we measure who is employed, who's not employed, how we measure the rate at which people are employed or aren't employed, and then the amount of people who are employed or want to be employed versus the regular population. Because all this is important in macroeconomics because it tells us, the unemployment rate tells us it's not 100% accurate in terms of its assessment, but it gives us a good indication of how our economy is doing in relationship to the amount of jobs that are available. So if we have high unemployment rates, then that's not really good because people are having a hard time finding a job. Whereas if we have low unemployment rates, that means it's good. It's not always accurate, and there are different types of employment, which I'll get to in the next video, but there are people, if you want to be, the definition for unemployment is essentially someone who is 16 or older who is actively looking for work. So if you're in this class and you're not 16 and you don't care to work, then you're not unemployed. If you're 25 and you're a student and you don't care to work, then you're not unemployed. Your grandparents, if they're retired and they're not working, are not unemployed because they're not actively looking for a job. There are people who don't have a job, who would like one, but aren't looking anymore, and they're not considered unemployed. And so that's sort of one of the downfalls of this rate. It doesn't take into account people who have just given up looking for a job. Also, part-time work means you are employed. You're not unemployed. So there are plenty of people who are only working part-time who would probably like to be working full-time but are not, and they're considered to be employed. So again, the unemployment rate is not a perfect measure of how the economy is doing in relationship to employment, but it's a pretty good one. So, like I said, unemployment is someone who is actively 16 or older, and who is actively looking for a job. And part-time workers mean you are not unemployed. Okay? And so what we want to know is who is out there. We call that the civilian labor force. And all that means, that's just employed people plus unemployed people. Okay? And so to find, let's say there are 66 million employed people and 4 million, so 66 million employed, 4 million unemployed, or 66 and 4, whichever one. That means our labor force participation rate, our civilian labor force, employed plus unemployed is 66 plus 4 is 70, right? To find the rate at which people are unemployed, you take the number of unemployed people over the civilian labor force times 100 to give it just moves the decimal, and that gives you your rate, right? So if there are 4 people who are unemployed and there are civilian labor force is 70, then 4 over 70 times 100 equals 5.7%, and that would be our unemployment rate in this scenario, right? So you can do another one if you like. If there are let's say 40 people who are working, so this is employed, and there are 10 people who are unemployed, right? That means the civilian labor force equals 50, right? That's the civilian labor force. To find the unemployment rate, you would just have 10, which is your unemployed, over your civilian labor force, which is 50, and 10 over 50 would be 20%, times 100 would be 20%. So 1 over 5 is 0.2 times 100, you move the decimal place over, 20%, and that's a really high unemployment rate. The government does not want to have 20% unemployment rate. Natural unemployment sort of goes up and down over time based on a number of factors, but we're looking at hopefully not much higher than 5 or 6 at a really good time. If it gets below 5, that's an incredible point. So that's what we're looking at now. That's unemployment rates, and labor force. We also want to know how many people are in the economy working, let's say either looking for a job or working, versus how many people are actually over 16. And what that does, it tells us, if we have we call that the labor force participation rate. If it's really high, that means we have a lot of people who are actively part of the economy. And what it also means is if it's really high, we're not having to take care of so many people. If we have a low labor force participation rate, that means the people who are working are having to take care of those who are not. So a low participation rate means that those who are not working are more burdensome financially, not good or bad, but financially to those who are working. And to find that, you just have the civilian labor force over the adults over 16 times 100. So let's say our labor force, let's say our adult labor group, right, is 116. So this number right here is, let's say 117. And we know CLF is 70. So 70 over 117 times 100 would be 60. So our labor force participation rate would be 60%. Actually, this would be this would more like this would be like adults over 16, right? That equals 117. So civilian labor force is 70 over adults over 16, which is 117 times 100 to move the decimal place over, and you get 60%. So that's how you figure up what is unemployment. That's how you figure up civilian labor force, unemployment rate, labor force participation rate. And remember, if you're looking to see who's employed and who's not employed, it must fit this: someone who is 16 and older, actively looking for a job. And the government has statistics based on who's actually looking versus who's not. And that's where they get these numbers, and they use these numbers to figure out this. So that is unemployment rate, civilian labor force, and adult participation.